They left a waitress bald for their amusement. Not as punishment. Punishment implies justice, implies proportion, implies some relationship between crime and consequence. This was entertainment. Sport. The kind of cruelty that happens when wealth convinces people that other humans exist for their amusement, and when a room full of witnesses decides that watching is easier than intervening. They filmed her tears. 14 phones, maybe more. Capturing every angle, every moment of violation, every second of a woman being destroyed for the sin of an accident she didn't cause. The videos would spread across social media within hours, racking up views and comments and shares. Brutal, people would type from the safety of their screens. Crazy, they'd add, scrolling past to the next piece of content, the next moment of someone else's suffering packaged as entertainment. They clinked champagne glasses while she bled dignity. Because the show must go on. Because uncomfortable silences are more disturbing than witnessing assault. Because if you acknowledge the horror happening 10 feet away, you might have to do something about it, and doing something costs more than most people are willing to pay. So they returned to their conversations, their networking, their performance of civilization while barbarism played out in their peripheral vision. Then her husband walked in. Not immediately. Not in time to stop it. But soon enough that Garrett Blackwood was still smiling, still basking in the glow of his conquest, still receiving nervous laughter from the sycophants at his table, who'd watched him shave a woman's head with kitchen scissors and decided that laughing was the safest response. Dominic Castellano. The ghost of Manhattan. The man whose name appeared in sealed court documents and whispered conversations but never in headlines, because people who made headlines became targets and Dominic had spent 3 decades making himself untouchable by remaining invisible. The man who owned the city in ways that didn't appear on any property deed or corporate charter. The man these people, these senators and socialites and self-made billionaires, only thought they knew. He walked into the Grand Ivory Ballroom at 8:51 p.m., 17 minutes after his wife's humiliation began, and the atmosphere changed so instantly that several people would later describe it as supernatural. The temperature dropped. Conversations faltered. People who recognized him went very still, the way prey animals freeze when they realize the apex predator has entered their territory. This is the story of what happens when cruelty meets consequence. When the powerful discover that power has hierarchies they never understood. When a man who treats humans as disposable learns that some people are protected by forces that don't appear in Forbes rankings or society pages. When the ghost stops haunting and starts hunting. And when a room full of people who watched atrocity without intervening discovers that witnessing has its own price. The bill was about to come due. Savannah Rhodes woke at 5:17 a.m. to an alarm that felt like violence. 3 hours of sleep. Her body needed 8 but had learned to function on 4, running on a deficit that compounded daily like interest on a loan she'd never be able to repay. The numbers started immediately, scrolling behind her closed eyelids before she even opened them. $1,847. The gap between what she had and what Mason needed. Between survival and catastrophe. Between her brother's next treatment and the void. She was at the pharmacy by 6, restocking shelves and running the register for the early crowd, construction workers buying energy drinks, nurses ending night shifts picking up prescriptions, insomniacs finally admitting defeat. Her manager, Ray, was decent enough not to comment on the exhaustion carved into her face. He knew about Mason. Everyone who worked with Savannah for more than a week learned about Mason, not because she talked about it, but because her entire life was structured around a 17-year-old boy whose bone marrow was trying to kill him. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The doctors had explained it with charts and statistics and careful neutrality, but what it meant was simple. Mason's body was producing damaged white blood cells faster than his treatments could eliminate them. Each round of chemotherapy bought time measured in weeks. Each remission was temporary. Each relapse came faster than the last. He'd been fighting for 14 months. He was tired. She could see it in his eyes when she visited him between shifts, not the physical exhaustion that sleep could fix, but something deeper. The fatigue of someone who'd been at war with his own cells and was starting to lose faith in victory. The pharmacy shift ended at noon. She had 45 minutes to get across town to Giuseppe's for the lunch rush. She ate a protein bar on the subway, standing because sitting would make her too comfortable, and comfortable would make her late. Giuseppe's was chaos from 12:30 to 2:30, tourists wanting authentic Italian, businessmen on expense accounts, regulars who knew her name and tipped 20%. Her feet were already aching by the time the rush ended, but the tips were good. $127 in 2 hours. She calculated immediately, that was nearly 7% of tonight's target. Mason's treatment could proceed. The equation could balance. She had 3 hours between shifts. Not enough to go home. She went to the hospital instead, bringing Mason the Thai food he'd been craving even though the nausea from his last treatment meant he'd probably only eat 3 bites. She sat by his bed while he slept, his head bald from chemotherapy, his skin translucent, IVs trailing from his arms like he was being held down by medical equipment. He was supposed to be applying to colleges. Instead, he was fighting cellular betrayal in a room that smelled like antiseptic and failure. "You don't have to keep doing this," he'd said last week, his voice hoarse. The Grand Ivory Ballroom was an ecosystem with its own predators, prey, and parasites. Savannah had learned to read these rooms the way biologists read tide pools, understanding the hierarchy, mapping the territories, identifying which species were dangerous and which were merely decorative. The Kensington's ballroom was premium habitat for Manhattan's apex predators, and tonight they'd gathered in concentration. Senator Whitmore held court at table 3, his laugh booming across the marble floors. He was the type who made a show of tipping generously, always 40%, always in cash, always with a comment about supporting working families. Last month he'd voted against the minimum wage increase that would have put an extra $200 a week in Savannah's pocket. She took his money and smiled and calculated the exact dollar amount of his hypocrisy every time she refilled his bourbon. Celeste Thorne Ashford commanded table 7 with performative grace. "Thank you so much, darling," she said when Savannah delivered her champagne, the kind of overfamiliar kindness that felt like condescension wrapped in silk. Celeste had built her personal brand on progressive advocacy. Her Instagram was full of posts about workers' rights and economic justice. Her investment portfolio was full of stock in companies that fought unionization and outsourced labor to countries without minimum wage laws. She treated staff with visible kindness because kindness was part of her aesthetic, but she'd never once supported legislation that might cost her money. Marcus Chun, the hedge fund manager at table 5, didn't pretend. He snapped his fingers when he wanted service, a gesture so casually dehumanizing that Savannah had to remind herself not to accidentally spill something on him. His date, barely 22, wearing a dress that cost more than Savannah's monthly rent, looked miserable and kept checking her phone under the table. Savannah recognized the expression, the calculation of whether the evening's payment was worth the degradation. But Garrett Blackwood was different. He wasn't just another predator in the ecosystem, he was an invasive species that poisoned everything around him. She'd been tracking him since his arrival at 747, watching him establish dominance through systematic cruelty. The busboy he'd humiliated was still pale and shaking, hiding in the service corridor. The servers were drawing straws to determine who'd handle his table. Even the other guests had created a buffer zone around table 4, as though cruelty might be contagious. He made jokes about the servers' appearances loud enough for them to hear. Did they hire from a modeling agency or a homeless shelter? He'd asked his companions, laughing at his own wit. When a server reached past him to clear a plate, he leaned back deliberately, forcing her to stretch awkwardly, then commented to his table about her posture. It wasn't just rudeness, it was weaponized, calculated to maximize humiliation while maintaining plausible deniability. The gala was supposedly raising money for hospitality workers' rights. Blackwood treated it as a networking opportunity, working the room between courses, collecting business cards, making deals. The cause was irrelevant. The people it claimed to help were invisible. This was theater, and he was here for the performance, not the plot. Savannah mapped her routes carefully, arcing wide around table 4, keeping the central dance floor as a buffer. Senator Whitmore was telling his Montana fishing story when the world tilted on its axis. "So there I am, waist deep in the Madison River, and I feel this pull." His right arm swept out dramatically, mapping the size of a trout that had probably been half the dimensions he was claiming. Savannah was passing behind him, the $3,000 bottle of Chateau Margaux balanced on her tray, her attention split between her route and the mental arithmetic that never stopped. She didn't see his elbow until it was already in motion. The impact was gentle, almost delicate, just enough force to destabilize the tray. Physics took over from there. The bottle lifted, suspended for a fraction of a second that stretched into eternity. Savannah's hand reached for it, fingers closing on empty air. The Chateau Margaux arced through the crystal chandelier light, crimson liquid catching and refracting into 1,000 ruby droplets, each one a separate catastrophe in miniature. It hit Garrett Blackwood like a baptism in blood. The wine soaked his chest, his lap, his face. The bottle shattered against the table edge, glass scattering across marble with a sound like breaking teeth. For one impossible moment, the grand ivory ballroom held its breath, 200 people frozen mid-conversation, mid-gesture, mid-thought. Savannah's heart stopped. Actually stopped, a full second of cardiac silence before her autonomic system remembered how to restart it. "I'm so sorry, sir, The words came automatically, the script written into her nervous system by 6 years of service work. Her hands were already moving with napkins she didn't have, her body defaulting to damage control even as her brain screamed that this was irreparable. Blackwood sat motionless, wine dripping from his chin. Then, slowly, deliberately, he smiled. Not the grimace of someone swallowing anger. A genuine smile, wide and delighted. He'd just been handed a gift. "Well," he said, rising from his chair. His voice carried to every corner of the acoustically perfect ballroom. "Looks like someone needs to learn a lesson about consequences." "It was an accident," Savannah heard herself say, hating the tremor in her voice. Senator Whitmore's elbow caught my. $3,000 of wine, Blackwood interrupted, turning to face the room, making himself a spectacle. "A custom Brioni suit. And you think accident makes that disappear?" He looked around, playing to his audience. "Does anyone here think an apology is sufficient?" The silence was deafening. Senator Whitmore studied his plate. Celeste Thorne Ashford found her phone fascinating. 200 witnesses, and not one voice in Savannah's defense. The floor manager appeared, Vincent, who'd worked for Dominic for 15 years, who knew exactly who Savannah was married to. "Mr. Blackwood, perhaps we could discuss appropriate compensation." Compensation. Blackwood's smile widened. "You think money fixes this?" He was enjoying himself now, feeding on the fear in Savannah's eyes, on the room's horrified attention. "No. What fixes this is a lesson. A memorable one." He paused, letting the tension build. Savannah could feel her pulse in her throat, could taste copper fear on her tongue. "Someone get me scissors," Blackwood said, his tone conversational, almost friendly. From the kitchen. Large ones. The temperature dropped 20 degrees. Vincent's hand tightened on Savannah's arm. "Mr. Blackwood, I don't think." "Scissors," Blackwood repeated, his voice hardening into something that cut. "Unless you'd like me to discuss tonight's service standards with the Kensington's ownership." Vincent's face went pale. The Kensington's ownership was buried in shell corporations, but eventually, those corporations led to Dominic. Blackwood didn't know that. Vincent did. But Vincent also knew his role tonight was floor manager, not enforcer, and floor managers didn't start wars in ballrooms full of witnesses. "Please," Savannah whispered. But Vincent was already turning toward the kitchen, already making the calculation that everyone in service learned eventually, some people mattered more than others. Blackwood gestured to an empty chair at his table. "Sit down," he told Savannah. "Let's give everyone something to remember." The scissors arrived on a silver tray, like they were part of the evening service. Kitchen shears, industrial grade, the kind designed to cut through chicken bones. Blackwood tested them twice, the blades snicking together with a sound that made Savannah's stomach clench. He gestured to the chair. "Sit." Her legs wouldn't move. Vincent's hand on her elbow was the only thing keeping her upright. "Please don't do this," she said, and hated how small her voice sounded, how it broke on the last word. "Sit," Blackwood repeated, "or I'll have security do it for you." She sat. The chair was ornate, high-backed, positioned so that everyone in the ballroom had a clear view. Blackwood was staging this deliberately, maximizing the audience. Around the room, phones lifted. 14, maybe more. Recording. Documenting. Bearing witness to nothing they'd report. "Let this be a lesson," Blackwood announced to the room, positioning himself behind her chair. "About competence. About consequences. About knowing your place." His hand grabbed a section of her hair. She'd worn it down tonight, professional but feminine, the way the Kensington preferred. His fist closed around the strands, pulling tight enough that her scalp burned. The first cut was the worst. The sound of blades against hair amplified by the ballroom's acoustics, broadcast to 200 people who sat frozen in their seats. Chunks of black hair fell to the marble floor like dead birds. Savannah's hands gripped the chair arms hard enough that her knuckles went white. She detached. It was a survival skill she'd learned young, back when their stepfather drank and got mean. Leave your body. Go somewhere else. Let the shell take the damage, while the essential part of you retreats to somewhere safe. She thought about Mason, about his treatment tomorrow, about the $1,847 she'd been trying to earn. She thought about Dominic, 3 rooms away, negotiating development deals while his wife was being violated in public. The rage was there too, buried under the detachment, burning like coals under ash. She catalogued it. Saved it. Knew that falling apart now would give Blackwood exactly what he wanted. He was narrating as he worked, performing for his audience. See how quiet she is? That's respect. That's understanding consequences. Snick. Another chunk fell. This is what happens when you forget your place. Snick. When you ruin something expensive and think sorry is enough. Snick. The cold metal of the blades occasionally grazed her scalp, deliberate near misses that made her flinch. Around the room, the reactions were uniform: horrified fascination, the inability to look away from atrocity. Some recorded. Some looked down but didn't leave. Senator Whitmore, whose elbow had caused this, had his hand over his mouth. Celeste Thorne Ashford was crying, silent tears that she didn't wipe away, but her feet stayed planted. Marcus Chun watched with the detached interest of someone observing an interesting social experiment. None of them intervened. Not one voice said stop. Not one person stood and walked out in protest. They were complicit in their silence, and Blackwood knew it, fed on it. When he finished, her hair lay in piles around the chair like evidence at a crime scene. He stepped back, admiring his work. Much better, he said. More honest. Now everyone can see exactly what you are. Nervous laughter rippled through his table. Someone, she couldn't see who, started a slow clap that died immediately when no one joined in. Clean yourself up, Blackwood said, dismissing her with a wave. You're making a mess. Savannah stood on legs that barely held her. Vincent appeared at her elbow, guiding her toward the staff corridor. The walk felt infinite, 200 pairs of eyes tracking her retreat, 200 witnesses who'd remember this and do nothing. The staff bathroom mirror was brutal and honest. Her head was a patchwork of scalp and uneven tufts, butchered rather than cut. She looked like a victim. Like someone who'd been destroyed for sport. Her hands were shaking so hard she had to grip the sink to steady them. The door opened. Marco, Dominic's lieutenant, head of security for half the properties in Manhattan, took one look at her and his expression went very, very still. The kind of still that preceded violence. He pulled out his phone, dialed without looking at the screen. Boss, he said quietly, his eyes never leaving Savannah's reflection. We have a situation. You need to come to the main ballroom. Now. A pause. Savannah could hear Dominic's voice through the phone, asking questions. It's Savannah, Marco said. Someone touched her. Someone. He looked at the hair scattered across the bathroom floor. Someone hurt her. In front of everyone. Another pause. Longer this time. Understood, Marco said finally. I'll make sure he doesn't leave. He ended the call, pocketed the phone, and met Savannah's eyes in the mirror. The ghost is coming, he said softly. And he's bringing consequences. Dominic Castellano was explaining the future of Red Hook's waterfront when Marco entered the Astor dining room. The negotiation had reached its conclusion, the union representatives had agreed to his terms, the city council member had found a way to expedite permits that respected both the letter and spirit of zoning law, and the developer had understood that 40% affordable housing wasn't a suggestion. Everyone was signing documents that would reshape 12 acres of Brooklyn when Marco leaned down and whispered 5 words in Dominic's ear. Someone hurt Savannah. In public. The change was instantaneous and invisible. Dominic's expression didn't shift, he maintained the same calm neutrality he'd worn throughout the negotiation. His posture didn't change. His hands remained still on the table. But every person in that private dining room felt the atmospheric pressure drop, felt the temperature plummet, felt something fundamental shift in the man sitting at the head of the table. Gentlemen, Dominic said, his voice perfectly modulated, we're concluded here. My attorney will handle the remaining documentation. He stood with unhurried grace, buttoning his suit jacket. "Thank you for a productive evening." The city council member started to respond, caught the look in Dominic's eyes, and went silent. The union representatives suddenly found the contract they'd just signed fascinating. The developer, who'd negotiated with Dominic for 6 months, recognized that tone, the impeccable politeness that preceded annihilation, and wisely said nothing at all. Dominic walked through the Kensington's private corridors with Marco half a step behind, listening as his lieutenant explained in terse sentences what had happened. Kitchen scissors. In front of everyone. They recorded it. He made it a show. With each detail, something in Dominic's chest grew colder and more focused. By the time they reached the entrance to the grand ivory ballroom, he was operating with the crystalline clarity that came before warfare. He entered through the main doors. Wanted to be seen. Wanted his arrival to register. The effect was immediate and radiating. The guests nearest the entrance recognized him first, Michael Torino, who'd borrowed money from the Castellano family to save his restaurant chain and was still paying the interest. Patricia Vance, whose late husband's gambling debts had been quietly forgiven in exchange for certain favors. They went very still, the kind of motionless that comes from prey animals recognizing predators. The stillness spread like a wave across the ballroom. Senator Whitmore's face lost color. He knew Dominic from certain private meetings where legislation was discussed in terms that never appeared in public record. Celeste Thorne Ashford suddenly found her phone mesmerizing, her progressive advocacy evaporating in the presence of someone whose power didn't require Instagram posts. Marcus Chun, the hedge fund manager, recognized Dominic from certain investment opportunities that existed in gray areas of financial law. The conversations died table by table as Dominic crossed the ballroom. His path was direct, unwavering, aimed at the service corridor where Marco had indicated Savannah was being held. The crowd parted without being asked. Then he saw her. Savannah was being led back onto the floor by Vincent. Blackwood had demanded she continue serving, maximizing her humiliation. She was trying to hold herself together, trying to maintain the professional mask, but Dominic could see the fractures in her composure. Her head was a butchered mess of uneven patches and exposed scalp. Her hands were shaking. Her eyes were holding back tears through sheer force of will. Around the room, phones were still out. Still recording. Documenting his wife's violation as entertainment. Something in Dominic's chest cracked open. Not rage. Rage was hot and impulsive. This was colder. More absolute. The kind of fury that calculates and plans and executes without mercy. He crossed to her in 4 strides, his movements unhurried but inevitable. When he reached her, his hands came up to frame her face, gentle, careful, the touch of someone handling something infinitely precious and irreparably damaged. "Savannah," he said softly, his voice carrying in the silence that had fallen over the ballroom. "Tell me what happened." She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "It was an accident." The wine, her voice broke. "Who did this to you?" She glanced toward table 4, where Garrett Blackwood was still holding court, still basking in his conquest, still oblivious to the fact that the room's energy had fundamentally shifted. Dominic looked up, his gaze finding Blackwood across the ballroom. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the acoustically perfect space. "You," he said to the man who'd just destroyed his wife. "Come here." Garrett Blackwood approached with the swagger of someone who'd never encountered consequences. He didn't recognize Dominic, moved in different circles, different strata of power. Real estate tycoons and tech moguls, not the kind of people who operated in shadows and shell corporations. He assumed this was another guest, maybe upset about the spectacle, maybe looking for social capital by white knighting for the help. "Look," Blackwood started, his tone dismissive, "she ruined a $3,000 suit. I was just..." Dominic raised a single hand. "Palm out." The gesture was small, almost gentle, but Blackwood's words died in his throat like he'd been physically struck. "I'm going to tell you a story," Dominic said, his voice quiet and perfectly modulated, carrying to every corner of the silent ballroom. "This city has rules. You don't know them because you've never needed to. You've operated in the world of contracts and permits and building codes, the visible infrastructure of power. But underneath that, there's a different set of rules. Older rules. And the people who actually run things, we know them." He stepped closer to Blackwood, close enough that only the front tables could hear his next words, though the entire room strained to listen. The first rule is this: you don't touch the people who serve you. You don't humiliate them. You don't turn their dignity into entertainment. Because those people, the ones you don't see, the ones you treat like furniture, they're connected to everyone. They're someone's daughter. Someone's sister. He paused, his eyes never leaving Blackwood's face. Someone's wife. Understanding began to dawn slowly on Blackwood's face, like sunrise filtered through fog. This woman you just violated in front of 200 witnesses, Dominic continued, his hand resting gently on Savannah's shoulder, is Savannah Castellano. My wife. And you didn't just cut her hair for sport, you declared war on something you don't understand and can't survive. Blackwood's face cycled through expressions in rapid succession. Disbelief first, this had to be a bluff, some kind of bizarre performance. Then confusion as he registered the name Castellano, searching his memory for why that should matter. Then finally, dawning horror as the connections formed. The Castellano family. The ghost of Manhattan. The stories he dismissed as urban legend suddenly acquiring weight and substance. I didn't know, Blackwood stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating like water on hot stone. Of course you didn't, Dominic said, almost kindly. That's the point. You've spent your entire life believing that your money made you untouchable. That wealth was the only power that mattered. That consequences were for other people. He glanced around the ballroom, at the crowd that had watched and filmed and done nothing. You tested that theory tonight. In front of witnesses. With documentation. He stepped back, creating distance, his arm sliding around Savannah's shoulders with infinite gentleness. This is the last moment of your old life, Dominic told him, his voice carrying that terrible calm that preceded violence. I want you to remember it. Remember how confident you felt 30 minutes ago. How untouchable. How certain that your money and your name could insulate you from anything. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Because by morning, you'll understand exactly how fragile all of that was. How quickly it can be taken away. How thoroughly someone can be erased when they violate the wrong person. Dominic turned, guiding Savannah toward the exit. Marco materialized at their side, along with two other men in dark suits who'd appeared from nowhere. As they walked, the crowd parted like water around stones, everyone desperate to create distance, to demonstrate they hadn't been complicit, hadn't laughed, hadn't recorded. Blackwood stood alone in the center of the ballroom, the space around him expanding as guests edged away. The people who'd been at his table moments ago were suddenly fascinated by the architectural details of the ceiling. Senator Whitmore was already making a phone call, likely to his attorney. Celeste Thorne Ashford was deleting videos from her phone with shaking fingers. The scissors lay on the floor near the ornate chair, surrounded by piles of black hair. Evidence at a crime scene. Documentation of the moment Garrett Blackwood had stepped over a line he hadn't known existed. And in the terrible silence that followed Dominic's exit, Blackwood understood with crystalline certainty that his life as he knew it had just ended. He just didn't yet understand how completely. The penthouse war room overlooked Manhattan like a command center surveying conquered territory. Dominic had guided Savannah to their bedroom first, settling her on their bed with careful hands, but she'd followed him back out within minutes. I need to see this, she'd said quietly. So she sat in the corner of his office, wrapped in one of his sweaters, watching her husband dismantle a man's life with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. The first call went to Lawrence Kim at 9:47 p.m. Lawrence specialized in regulatory archaeology, digging through corporate records to find the violations that every company committed but only some got prosecuted for. Blackwood Development Corporation, Dominic said without preamble. I need everything. EPA compliance, OSHA records, tax filings, offshore accounts. By dawn, I want simultaneous audits hitting every property he owns. Lawrence didn't ask why. Had worked with the Castellano family long enough to know that when Dominic requested surgical strikes, there were reasons that didn't require explanation. Consider it done. He's been sloppy with environmental assessments. I can have EPA inspectors at his Brooklyn site by 7 a.m. Make it 6, Dominic said. I want him waking up to crisis. The second call was more delicate. Judge Patricia Morales had been appointed to the federal bench with Dominic's quiet support. Campaign contributions routed through enough donors that the connection was invisible but understood. Patricia, he said when she answered, his tone carefully neutral. I'm calling to report suspicious activity. Blackwood Development has been obtaining permits for projects that don't meet zoning requirements. I believe there may be fraud involved. A pause. Patricia was too smart not to understand what was happening, but also too smart to acknowledge it directly. I see. Can you provide documentation? It'll be on your desk by morning. Along with testimony from city planning officials who've been feeling pressured to approve applications that should have been denied. I'll review it immediately, she said. The unspoken understanding, she'd find exactly what Dominic needed her to find. The third call went to Thomas Red Donovan, union leader for the construction and general building laborers. Red owed Dominic more favors than he could count, contracts secured, pension funds protected, rivals neutralized. Red, every Blackwood site in the city. I want labor actions. Safety complaints, permit violations, whatever grounds you can manufacture. Nothing moves on his projects starting tomorrow. How long you want them shut down? Until I say otherwise. By midnight, Sienna Cross arrived at the penthouse, a tech investigator who specialized in digital forensics and had built her practice on discretion. She set up her laptop on Dominic's conference table and started pulling social media. 14 videos so far, she reported. Posted from the gala, already shared thousands of times. Clear documentation of assault. The scissors, the hair, her visible distress. This is prosecutable if you want to go that route. Not criminal charges, Dominic said. Those take too long and give him too much opportunity to play victim. But I want every video archived, time-stamped, and prepared for civil litigation. Assault, battery, intentional infliction of emotional distress. I want documentation that survives any deletion attempts. Between calls, he checked on Savannah. Brought her tea she didn't drink. Sat beside her on the couch and let her lean against him in silence. You don't have to watch this, he said softly. Yes, I do, she replied. I need to see that there are consequences. That what he did wasn't just something I have to swallow and move on from. There are always consequences, Dominic said. For hurting the people I love, the consequences are total. By 2 a.m., the dominoes were positioned. Lawrence had filed complaints with 5 regulatory agencies. Patricia had issued warrants for document seizures. Red had union reps visiting every Blackwood site to identify safety violations that would shut down operations. Sienna had archived the videos and prepared a litigation package that would survive any attempts at digital erasure. At 3:07 a.m., Garrett Blackwood's phone rang for the first time. His general counsel, calling to inform him that federal agents would be executing search warrants at his corporate headquarters in 3 hours. That EPA inspectors were already at his Brooklyn site. That his legal exposure was catastrophic and immediate. In the penthouse, Dominic ended his final call and turned to Savannah. It started, he said simply. She nodded, something like satisfaction crossing her face. Good. Day 1 began with his general counsel's resignation email, time-stamped 6:47 a.m. Effective immediately. Ethical concerns regarding ongoing investigations preclude my continued representation. No phone call. No explanation. Just abandonment formatted in corporate letterhead. Garrett read it 3 times, his coffee going cold in his hand, before his CFO called with worse news. Our primary lender is calling in the loans. All of them. They want $47 million by end of business Friday or they're seizing collateral. The CFO's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. I've been trying to reach our other banking relationships. Nobody's returning calls. By noon, the assault videos had gone viral. Not just on social media, news outlets were running them with Garrett's face unblurred, his full name in headlines. Real estate heir assaults waitress at charity gala. The videos had been archived, replicated, spread across platforms faster than his publicist could issue takedown requests. His PR firm dropped him by 2 p.m. We can't represent someone who's become a liability to our other clients. Garrett tried his usual playbook, called in favors, reminded people of past deals, suggested that mutually beneficial relationships shouldn't evaporate over bad press. But the doors that had always opened were suddenly locked. Calls went to voicemail. Emails received auto-replies. The network he'd assumed was solid turned out to be vapor. Day 2 brought federal agents to his office at 7 a.m. EPA, OSHA, IRS, simultaneous raids with warrants so comprehensive they covered 3 decades of business records. His staff was sent home. His computers were seized. His files were boxed and loaded into unmarked vans while reporters filmed from the street. At 3 p.m., his father held a press conference. Garrett watched it live on his phone, sitting in his now empty office. My son's actions are inexcusable and do not represent the values of Blackwood Development. Effective immediately, he is removed from the board and stripped of all operational authority. The company founded by my father will not be tarnished by his cruelty. His father. The man who taught him that wealth was power, that consequences were for poor people, that the world existed to serve their interests. Now publicly disowning him to save the family business. His society friends, the people who'd laughed at his table, who'd watched him shave Savannah's head and done nothing, suddenly couldn't remember his number. Texts went unanswered. Invitations were rescinded. Marcus Chen, who'd been at his table that night, released a statement condemning his abhorrent behavior. Senator Whitmore suggested in an interview that he'd always found Blackwood's conduct troubling. Day 3 brought financial annihilation. His personal accounts were frozen pending IRS investigation into offshore holdings that Lawrence Kim had somehow uncovered. His corporate accounts were inaccessible due to the ongoing federal raids. He couldn't pay his staff, his lawyers, his mortgage. His mistress, a model he'd been supporting in a Tribeca apartment, sold her story to 3 tabloids. He was cruel and controlling. I'm relieved to be free of him. By evening, his wife's attorney delivered divorce papers seeking full custody of their 2 children, citing temperament unsuitable for parenting with the assault videos as evidence. Every door was closing. Every exit was blocked. Every ally was now a liability trying to distance themselves. Garrett sat in his penthouse, which would be seized within a week to cover debts, and finally understood that this wasn't random. This was orchestrated. Someone had done this. Someone with enough power to move federal agencies, influence banks, turn his own father against him. Someone finally told him the truth, Dominic Castellano. The ghost of Manhattan. The man whose wife he'd violated in front of 200 witnesses. On the morning of day 4, Garrett went to the Castellano building. Not with lawyers or leverage. With nothing but desperation and the hope that begging might achieve what his money and name couldn't. Mercy from a man he'd given every reason to show none. Garrett Blackwood arrived at the Castellano building at 9:23 a.m., looking like a man who'd aged a decade in 4 days. Unshaven, wearing yesterday's clothes, a wrinkled Oxford and slacks that had cost $800 but now looked like costumes from someone else's life. His eyes were hollow, ringed with sleeplessness and desperation. The security guard who escorted him to the penthouse elevator said nothing, but his contempt was palpable. He was made to wait in Dominic's office for 47 minutes. Long enough to understand this wasn't a negotiation between equals. Long enough to catalog his own destruction in the city skyline visible through floor-to-ceiling windows, buildings he'd developed, projects he'd overseen, an empire that was already being parceled out to creditors and rivals. When Dominic finally entered, Savannah was with him. That was Garrett's first indication that mercy wasn't on the table. She'd been his victim. Now she was here to witness his accounting. Her hair had been cut professionally since that night, styled short in a way that was deliberate rather than damaged. She wore a simple black dress and held herself with a dignity he tried to strip away. Mr. Castellano, Garrett started, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. I made a terrible mistake. I was drunk, I wasn't thinking clearly, I never meant. The videos make it look worse than it was. He was rambling now, throwing out justifications like a drowning man grasping for debris. I'll make this right. Financial compensation, a public apology, whatever you want. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Dominic let him finish. Let the apologies and rationalizations exhaust themselves. Then he walked to his desk, sat, and gestured for Garrett to remain standing. The power dynamic was absolute. You treated my wife like she was nothing because you could, Dominic said, his voice measured and calm. Because no one stopped you. Because a room full of people watched and decided their comfort was more important than her dignity. That wasn't just cruelty, it was a lesson. You taught everyone there that this behavior is acceptable. That power means permission to humiliate. That consequences are for other people. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Garrett's face. So now I'm teaching a different lesson. What happened to you over the past 4 days wasn't revenge. It was education. A demonstration for every person in this city who works in service, who's ever been humiliated by someone who thought their money made them untouchable. You became the example of what happens when you cross certain lines. I understand, Garrett said desperately. I've learned. You're going to prison, Dominic interrupted, checking his watch. Not for what you did to Savannah, that's not technically criminal, though it should be. But for everything else we found when we looked. And believe me, we looked everywhere. Tax fraud, bribery, environmental violations you covered up, building code violations that endangered lives. You've been breaking laws for years, confident that your money and your name would protect you. You can't, Garrett started, then stopped as he heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, official footsteps. I already did, Dominic said as FBI agents entered his office. They're here for you. The evidence has been compiled and delivered. Your attorneys, the ones who haven't abandoned you, will explain your options, but we both know there's only one outcome. The lead agent read Garrett his rights while Savannah watched in silence. When they led him toward the elevator, he looked back at her once, searching for something: forgiveness, sympathy, acknowledgement that he was human too. She gave him nothing. Just watched him leave the way he'd watched her walk away with her dignity in pieces on the marble floor. 6 months later, the sentencing hearing lasted 4 hours. Garrett Blackwood received 8 years in federal prison for fraud, racketeering, and environmental crimes that had endangered dozens of construction workers. His father didn't attend. His ex-wife had already remarried. The empire that had taken 3 generations to build was dissolved, its assets distributed to creditors and victims. That same afternoon, Savannah stood at a podium in the Castellano Foundation's new headquarters, addressing 200 hospitality workers. Her hair had grown back, styled confidently. Her voice was steady and clear. What happened to me happens too often, she said, looking out at faces that reflected her own experience. Exhaustion, determination, the particular armor of people who'd learned to survive in rooms that didn't see them as human. People in power treat service workers as disposable. They humiliate us because they can. Because the system protects them and not us. Because speaking up costs more than staying silent. She paused, letting the weight of that truth settle. It ends today. The Worker Protection Initiative provides legal defense, financial support, and advocacy for anyone in the service industry facing abuse. If someone humiliates you, assaults you, violates your dignity, you call us. Immediately. You don't have to accept it. You don't have to smile through it. You don't have to be silent. The applause started slowly, then built like a wave. Savannah looked out at the crowd, busboys and servers, janitors and housekeepers, the invisible infrastructure of Manhattan's wealth, and saw not victims but an army. Dominic watched from the back of the room, his hand resting on Marco's shoulder. She's better at this than I ever was, he said quietly. Different kind of power, Marco replied. Same results. On the screen behind Savannah, a single image, the grand ivory ballroom, empty now, its crystal chandeliers dark. A reminder of where this started. A promise that it would never happen again. Not in their city. Not to their people. Not without consequences that would echo for years.